You're listening to In the Fast Lane. This is episode number 9 of the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Matt Clayton with you in the host chair as we break down everything that happened in Sunday's Belgian Grand Prix, with the first race of Formula One's latest triple header dominated once again by championship leader Lewis Hamilton. It was the second 1-2 finish for Mercedes in 7 races this year, with Valtteri Bottas coming home second, while Max Verstappen and Red Bull rounded out the podium. The 5th time this year that trio has taken home the silverware. The big news though for Australian fans was a superb 4th place for Daniel Ricciardo and Renault. Daniel's most convincing weekend in yellow from start to finish, and the fastest lap of the race was the icing on the cake for him. A little later on, we're going to be joined by a former F1 racer and our expert Sky Sports pundit Paul Di Resta to discuss the race and plenty of other topics. But first in the co-host chair is a man who moves faster than a Ferrari down the Kemmel Straight at Spa. I guess most things do, really. Hello, Michael Laminato.
It's not so hard, Matt. I don't know if that's really a compliment at all.
Well, it was meant as a compliment. You can take it however you like. But look, we'll circle back to Ferrari a bit later, but let's stay with the front of Sunday's race for now. We had Hamilton leading every lap from pole. We had Bottas in second place every lap from second on the grid. Verstappen starting and finishing third. To my mind, this race was dictated by 2 things. One, Hamilton being able to hold off the pack into Les Combes on lap 1, which is always tricky there. But then the race was more or less set once most of the field pitted for their one tyre stop a bit earlier than they would have wanted to, after that lap 11 crash between Antonio Giovinazzi and George Russell and the safety car that prompted. From then on, it was more a case of tyre management like the second Silverstone race, wasn't it? But I guess with a different outcome this time.
Yeah, this was essentially another Silverstone replay, but without tyre explosions in it. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunately. It's a good thing everyone got out of that one unscathed. But it did mean that essentially from lap 11 or 12, whenever the pit stop actually happened, from lap 15 at the restart anyway, it was just about tyre management, which was a real shame because there was some potential for some interesting setups in this Grand Prix, different cars running different setups, which meant their advantages would have been different throughout the race, and we didn't get to see that play out. And it also meant that, look, it was probably unlikely to happen, but if Bottas wanted to try something different at the first stop, if he wanted to try and be a bit more aggressive with Hamilton, he wasn't going to be able to do it because it was all just about getting to the end of that race with compounds that are softer than are normally brought to Belgium. So really we had maybe 10 laps of racing and then the rest was just about relaxing on your Sunday night, I think.
Well, we almost got our rain. We almost got lots of things, but what we do know, Lewis Hamilton's 5th win of this year. He's 89th in total. He's now just 2 behind Michael Schumacher's all-time mark. He's now 47 points ahead of Verstappen in the standings and 50 points, or 2 race wins if you like, ahead of his teammate in Valtteri Bottas. Now, look, I know we've still got 10 races here, but do we start preparing to write the words mathematically possible as we start heading towards these next few races? Because it seems like an inevitable march now to that 7th world title, doesn't it?
I'm going to set up a spreadsheet after this just so I know exactly when I can use that mathematical impossibility tag. This is the biggest advantage after 7 rounds Hamilton has had in a championship race. So, if you wanted to be the pessimist, that's certainly looking like it's a done deal at this point. Which is, very demoralising, you must think, for Valtteri Bottas, because only in that first race, which he won, obviously, did he look like a title contender. He's lost ground progressively every race since, because Hamilton has been on such a charge and couldn't even finish ahead of him in the one race that neither he nor Hamilton won, which is obviously a poor sign. And you've got to think it's doubly demoralising because while, in races like this, he never really challenged Hamilton, on qualifying, for example, he's been close when he hasn't been the pole sitter. And in most races, while he hasn't been on Hamilton's pace, it's not as if he's been dominated absolutely by Hamilton. So year on year, he's improved, but he just still cannot get over that bar that Hamilton is setting.
Well, it's the bar that keeps getting raised with the way he's performing this season. Outside of that top 3, we mentioned Daniel Ricciardo earlier, just a terrific 4th place for Renault at a circuit where they were pretty confident that would suit the sweet spot of that car. It's Daniel's equal best result since he's been at Renault, and he had his first fastest lap since Hungary 2018 when he was still at Red Bull. 5th for Esteban Ocon meant that Renault had its best race since it returned to F1 as a fully fledged constructor in 2016. Given we've got Monza this coming Sunday, that result does bode particularly well for the Italian Grand Prix, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is a car that loves not having downforce on it. I thought it was really interesting, actually, that Daniel was saying that the more downforce they took off, the better balanced it felt, which I guess gives the team a little bit of direction in terms of how they develop that chassis. Maybe they really have to start from scaling it back and then rearrange the philosophy from there. there, notwithstanding we've got new regulations coming in a couple of years, but you've got to think Monza must be pretty good. In fact, this calendar is almost built for Renault in a sense that they've taken all the maximum downforce tracks off of it. And we saw already in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago that is one of the higher downforce tracks. The car was not so good. And now we've got a lot of circuits that require a real lack of downforce. So that car should be performing quite well, you'd think, over the balance of the season. In the fight for McLaren for third, let's leave Racing Point out of this equation for a little bit, so it might actually be the fight for fourth, let's say. The McLaren also looked relatively good, but you've got to say, in this super low downforce configuration, Renault must be very, very happy with the overall balance of this season.
Very much so, and I think you mentioned that midfield battle now. Renault's just 9 points off third place in the constructors' standing, so it definitely is concertinaing there. Daniel just 3 seconds off Verstappen in the podium at the end, 21 seconds ahead of his teammate. So fantastic weekend for Daniel in Spa. Behind Esteban Ocon came Alexander Albon for Red Bull. Another tricky weekend for him, given that he started 5th, finished 6th. He was nearly half a minute behind his teammate. He's now to 4th in the drivers' standings, but he scored 48 points to Verstappen's 110. So that's something we'll definitely explore with Paul Di Resta in a moment. But moving through the rest of the points-paying finishes, Lando Norris 7th for McLaren, while the driver that was awarded the driver of the day was Pierre Gasly, who was 8th for AlphaTauri. Started 12th, ran a really long first stint on those hard tyres, didn't pit under the safety car. What did you make of his race, Michael? And also that pass of Sergio Perez heading down into Eau Rouge on lap 3, that was borderline on a little bit too robust in terms of Perez's defence. How did you see that? Because that was very tight.
Yeah, I wonder if there was a bit of frustration creeping into Perez's game there, because this was a weekend that was going fairly poorly for Racing Point, considering they're ordinarily extremely strong at this circuit. Gasly had a ripping Grand Prix, for want of a better phrase. Even that safety car, which was pretty poorly timed for his strategy, which was to run long in that first stint, didn't hamper him too much. They opted not to stop to try and do something different. One of only 2 drivers, really, Perez ironically being the other one, who did something different in this race, was really quick on the hard tyres in that first stint, more so than anyone else. And then with mediums in the second stint, when everyone was doing that long run of management we were talking about, just cut through the field like butter. And you've got to wonder, if there was no safety car, of course that would have changed things for everyone, but probably there was another 1 or 2 positions to be gained for Gasly, and this is a driver that's really going from strength to strength back at AlphaTauri, dominating over his teammate Kvyat. It's hard to say what is in the long-term future for a Red Bull junior driver at any time, really, but he's doing himself no disservice, I think, with these performances.
Well, you know where I stand on Gasly. I think they may have bailed on him too early, but we'll move swiftly along. You mentioned Perez before. Lance Stroll was 9th, Perez 10th on a pretty anonymous weekend for Racing Point, so they did fall back in the constructors a little bit. But look, we have to have this conversation. The one team we haven't mentioned yet, Ferrari. It's hard to find adjectives at this point to encapsulate just how dire that weekend was for Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc. 13th and 14th respectively. You rewind 12 months, Leclerc has won his first Grand Prix at Spa. Ferrari locked out the front row. They were absolutely nowhere the entire weekend. What is going on here? Because, look, I think this weekend, they didn't have particularly high expectations to start with, but I think it managed to even go beneath those.
What words cannot describe a roll of Carlos Sainz's eyes and a shake of the head does amply well, I think.
That is so true.
This is embarrassing territory for Ferrari, because we know that car's underpowered. It has been since that confidential agreement reached with the FIA over the off-season about the power unit that was so strong last year that locked out the front row in Belgium last year. This season it's been all over the place. But I think as much as Spa showed that up to be the case, it also showed up that the chassis is no good. The aero of that car is incredibly inefficient, which meant when they tried to put downforce on it to try and balance it out, it still didn't do anything for them. And I thought what was really concerning was that after qualifying, which was also dreadful, they said, but the car is a little bit geared towards the race. It was arguably worse in the race. I mean, they finished behind Kimi Räikkönen in a customer Ferrari-engined Alfa Romeo and only 5 seconds ahead of Nicholas Latifi, a rookie in a Williams car. If this isn't the nadir, then what happens after that? Because this is a team that's spending and earning more than anyone else. This should not be happening.
Well, the good news for Ferrari, of course, is they can get to the next race with no pressure or that'd be the Italian Grand Prix at Monza next Sunday. So difficult times coming up for them, and it might just as well be that there's no fans at the circuit next weekend. There's some really, really tough times for that team at the moment.
Might be some protesters, though.
There might be. So look, that's how the Belgian Grand Prix played out. But To expand on the stories behind those results and plenty of other things besides, it's time to introduce this week's special guest. Joining us on this week's episode of In the Fast Lane, we're very pleased to be able to chat with a man who wears many hats. He started 59 Grand Prix for Force India and Williams. He's currently racing in the World Endurance Championship for United Autosports, and he's become one of the sport's foremost analysts with his work for Sky Sports. It's an early morning Belgian welcome to Paul Di Resta. Hey Paul, how are you?
I'm not too bad, thanks. You?
Yeah, going well, thank you. Appreciate the early start for you. And well, look, it's a Monday after another Sunday for Lewis Hamilton where he's stood on the top step of the podium. It's a very familiar sight, of course, this season. That very much looked like a race under his control until we had that little spectre of tyre wear becoming an issue late. Did you suspect from your vantage point that we might be seeing the beginnings of Silverstone Part 2 on our hands near the end, or do you think that Mercedes had learned from what happened there and had it much more under control than they did last month at Silverstone?
So I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Obviously, Spa very much like Silverstone in terms of the load, how the cars work. But then if you have to say, I think it's more in the drivers' minds what was going on. I think when you're running out and freer like they were, not battling with each other, not pushing each other to the extreme levels, always in the back of your mind, you're thinking about what could be, what could go wrong. And I guess that's probably where they got to. It was a very controlled weekend by Hamilton, actually, as dominant as you kind of see them. But I guess the biggest thing is, what pressure Valtteri Bottas can put on him, because Max is kind of powerless. I think he extracts the maximum out of his package and what he's got available. Sometimes he can get on top of him, but Lewis seems to be able to control his teammate. When he's asked to go a couple of tenths quicker, he can respond any time. Listening to the team radio when I was back in Sky Race Control. And, until somebody gets in that car alongside him that can consecutively get the momentum off Lewis's side, I don't really see how people are going to change that winning kind of format that he's on, with the whole scenario that he's got going on with the team, the structure, the stability. He gets the job done. But Red Bull are pretty close. Obviously, when we get to Mugello, things may get a little bit easier on their side because the temperatures are coming back into their kind of window that they need to operate in. Like we're talking about those things that you were saying at the end of the Grand Prix. So it's nice that Max is in the mix, but Mercedes are just too strong.
Sticking with Lewis for a second, I think we sometimes overlook or forget that he's the second oldest driver on the grid now because of this relentless winning that he's been doing. He's 36 early next year. Do you see a time frame for how long he can stay at his peak? Has he even reached his peak? And does age become a factor in modern day Formula One, or is he kind of more likely to lose motivation or be complacent with setting records and speed actually slowing him down as he gets older?
You'd arguably say he's in his peak. Formula One's gone through through a younger generation, which is a bit odd actually, how there's not many old drivers kicking around. But I would say, where he is at the moment, he's cool, he's calculated, he's clearly still got the speed, he's still got the wheel-to-wheel racing, and comes out on top generally 99% of the time as well. So I don't see anything changing for a long time. At the same time, while he's at the top of the sport, while he's got the machine under him, he'll continue to drive on. You can see Fernando Alonso's thought if he didn't have a winning car, he obviously felt he needed some time away before coming back next year with Renault. But, there's going to be some pretty good guys on the grid. And it's nice to see these guys, middle age, I would say, get into the later stages of what your racing career is, putting up against the youngsters, because the youngsters clearly have the speed, but you've got to have the whole package. And when you're representing a brand like Mercedes-Benz, they need a worldwide figure, and that's what they get.
From a man who's on top of his game to a team that certainly isn't, the other story from the Belgian Grand Prix was, of course, Ferrari. Pretty dreadful in qualifying, an extremely forgettable race, but for the fact that they were way off the pace, considering this was a team that was dominant this time last year, and this year finished 70 seconds behind Hamilton. What's your reading on what is happening inside Ferrari, the atmosphere inside Ferrari at the moment? Do you think something or someone needs to change, or is it more of a matter of trying to be patient and hoping for next year or perhaps even the year after with new regulations now?
Well, I don't think anything's going to change too soon, in the sense we've got stability in the regulations. We've got a token system where you can't absolutely redesign a car. So they're kind of stuck where they are going into next year. The chassis obviously stays where it is. Wind tunnel time is very limited. CFD time is limited. But it is crisis at the moment. That is not where Ferrari need to be. There was times when they were, the four-time world champion was last on Friday afternoon at the Spa at the Grand Prix. Now, regardless of fuel level, regardless of the engine modes, that was genuinely where they are, and they're just not on top of it. Whatever's happened last year with the directive from the FIA has affected Ferrari. There's absolutely no two ways about that. You can see that in the GPS overlays. Their top speed is very, very different to where it was last year. But they're also saying they've got a very draggy car from an aero side of things. When you actually watch the onboard, it's fairly balanced, but it's just not delivering the performance that anybody wants to see that red car at the top. You can hear in Sebastian's voice, he's obviously feels like he's been let down quite a bit by the team. Charles is starting to say that's the maximum he can extract. But more importantly for Formula One, you need to see Ferrari at the front, and they are a big player, a big part of what it is, big team. They need to look at the structures, they need to look at the heads, and I think they just need to, put the job with the right person. You can't go in there and absolutely blitz the place and empty it out, because these people have got reputations. It's just about maybe redirecting their attention into different areas and allowing other opinions to come in that maybe were overlooked in the past.
Sticking with Ferrari, Paul, there's obviously so much discussion down here in Australia when Ferrari sort of kicked off the driver market musical chairs by not offering Sebastian a new contract. People logically linked the Australian driver with the Italian surname, with the vacant seat that eventually went to Carlos Sainz. With the way Ferrari season has gone and what we're looking at for 21, and combined with the upturn in McLaren's performance, do you think Daniel Ricciardo might have actually dodged a bit of a bullet there and be the best place of these drivers that are shuffling seats for the next couple of years?
We were talking about it yesterday. I actually think, Red Bull have overlooked Daniel. I know it probably didn't end in the terms they wanted, but there was a chance there to get him back. Now, whether it was right the way he left before, because I believe he was very close to signing that contract before, at the very last minute, diverted to Renault. Now, sometimes you need to go away, you need to refocus. But I actually think he would have been more suited to go back there, because he knew Max, he knew Red Bull, he fits the brand, they deliver at the front. And then there's a tie with Ferrari. Before, I thought he was a very good fit. I would probably say he was more of a fit when I see what Ferrari need at the moment, purely because they need race winners. They're going into next year with somebody that's on that team that's only won 3 races. I believe Charles won last year. Carlos has had 1 podium, but it's quite a lot of media attention and quite a lot of weight to put on themselves. Where it is undoubtedly, Carlos is a very quick driver. You cannot deny that. And speed, he absolutely deserves it. But I think, I was shocked to see where they've went, but that was maybe a decision, them thinking they've got this restructure. Maybe they saw more than we saw early, and they're thinking more about the future. Maybe age was on side with the 2 drivers they've got, and that's Carlos and Charles. Charles is becoming a team leader. But, looking at Daniel's position, a Mercedes-Benz powered car in the back of that McLaren, I think that'll be a strong package. And you saw Lando Norris was very strong at the end of the Grand Prix last year. He's had some great recoveries. And the team is coming up, led by Zach, led by Andreas Seidel. They are the biggest up-and-coming team. They are on a curve that just continues to keep going, and I think surprising a few people. But then you got to look at Renault, what they did yesterday as well, getting in the midfield. So nice to see that midfield battle that's not been there for the last couple of years is really revitalising itself, and some big names coming back into the play of it.
You touched on Red Bull Racing there, possibly lacking a driver of Daniel Ricciardo's seniority for the last couple of years. And for the last couple of years, neither other driver in that team has been able to get anywhere near Max Verstappen. It was Pierre Gasly last year. Alex Albon struggling a little bit this year as well. The whole situation with the Red Bull driver talent pool, I suppose, is a little bit unusual though, isn't it? Because on the one hand, they seem to really want to, I guess, defend Albon's place in that team, when this time last year, of course, they turfed Gasly for similar results. And then if you do look at AlphaTauri, which is meant to be the junior team bringing up talent, they've got 2 drivers who they have rejected, I suppose, for the senior team. Is that whole driver conveyor belt, if you like, of talent a little bit miscalibrated at the moment? Is there a purpose for AlphaTauri if they're not bringing in new drivers? And perhaps do they need to start looking outside of their pool to find someone to Max Verstappen in that second senior car?
Well, I think, to be honest, if they were going to replace Albon at any point, I think they probably would look outside the system. It's Albon's seat to lose. If he delivers the results, he'll keep it. They've very much got an arm around him. They're protecting him. They're giving him the best opportunity they can, which is how I think a team principal and how the team leader should do it. But the reality is, it depends what's on the timesheet at the end of the sessions and where the results end up. But it was quite interesting after the race yesterday. Lewis Hamilton, in his interview, said, Red Bull have only got one driver that's competing with us, and that's hampering their performance. If they had two drivers like myself and Bottas, Lewis said, as close in competitiveness, they would be putting us more uncomfortable throughout the weekend and over the course of race strategy. So you can see they're using that, and that's obviously clearly in their head where they're thinking. And if you look at Spa, they very much went into qualifying Red Bull with different strategies. They gave Albon the soft tyre in Q2, Max was on the medium, as with the two Mercedes. And that already shows you that they were not fully confident that he was going to deliver the performance of Max to start the race on the preferred tyre if he could progress through. All that in the back of the mind, if Red Bull as a constructor want to take it to Mercedes, they need to have two drivers like when Daniel and like where Max had that balance of performance and competitiveness. And that is only good in a team. And I believe that probably was the strongest lineup on paper when they were paired. They've suffered since Daniel's gone on. They've suffered to get that side of things, but at times have been able to do it. But you need two guys sharing the workload over the weekend, as any team. I guess the headache is good when you've got two drivers that are going into the first corner, lined up alongside each other, battling. It's a good problem to have.
I think it's a headache they'd probably welcome at the moment. I did want to, Paul, talk about one of your old teammates who is not on the grid for the remainder of this year and next year at the moment, in Nico Hülkenberg. We saw what he did for Racing Point when he came in for Sergio Perez at Silverstone, what he did with no preparation. Two-part question for you. Do you think that enhances his prospects of returning to the grid? And I did want to tap into your experience of being thrown in the deep end like that, because I'm casting my mind back to Hungary 2017, where you actually had less preparation than Nico. I think you didn't know you were driving until after FP3 from memory, and next thing you know, you're in a Williams trying to qualify it. How challenging is that to be able to come in with no seat time, no preparation, you don't necessarily have the fitness, and you're supposed to be up to speed straight away? Because for you, that must have been quite a bizarre weekend back then.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways of looking at it. I mean, I hadn't driven a car for 3 years in F1. I'd only done half a day in the simulator that year. I was busy, actively, obviously still racing DTM, then doing my Sky duties. But, I was in the meetings, I was familiar with faces. But when you're dropped in the hot seat straight into qualifying, that's obviously a massive ask. Then, but the reality is when you get in the car, you feel very much at home. I hadn't even done a proper seat fit in a race car before I drove the car. So I did that literally in the mock-up chassis, was dropped into it. But when the visor drops and you drop the speed limit at the end of the pit lane, you're back home. But at that point, I hadn't even driven the turbo hybrid car. I'd only driven the normally aspirated V8 with cars. The team made it as easy as possible as they could, but fortunately I was confident enough to get up to a reasonable speed, and I thought did the most I could within the time and not putting myself an unnecessary risk through those 4 laps that I got in qualifying to get within I think it was within 6/10 of land. So another set, another time to go. Already a difficult car to drive as well, where Williams were kind of spiralling down the grid from where they were obviously finishing the years previous. And then with Nico, different. I mean, the reality is Nico only missed 3 races. I know he was out of the car for 6 months, but the other drivers were out of the cars for 4 months and didn't do anything during lockdown. Nico did nothing less than I expected him to do if he was dropped in a car, to be fair. It's a guy with great reputation, great focus, good natural ability, good speed, and he delivered what I thought he should have done. I would have expected him to be quicker than Lance Stroll. He managed to do that in the second weekend, and he's probably put himself in the shop window, but I don't think he was ever out it, to be fair. I think it was the reality last year he found himself. It was all happening a bit too late in the season when things changed around, but I guess that was probably on the side of Renault looking into the future, having a French driver, having somebody young, and probably learning off the more senior guy who was Daniel Ricciardo. And when you pair two guys like Daniel and Nico together, they're very similar, but whoever comes on top is going to keep the drive. And Daniel, obviously managed to, I would say, dominate Nico in terms of qualifying speed last year.
Before you had that run into Williams, of course, you had your career proper, I suppose, at Racing Point, or Force India as it was called then. Looking at them from the outside, they've taken a massive step forward this season for various reasons, some of them contentious, I suppose. But do you see that the mindset change, I suppose, from being a midfield team that really squeezes everything out of limited resources to being a team that kind of has designs on being a front runner, sometimes has the pace of being a front runner and has to compete with them, as being a bit of a difficult transition for these guys?
I think the biggest thing at the moment is the money stream is very different. The budget's coming in. Lawrence, obviously, with this consortium, has bought the team and is willing to invest quite a lot of cash. And then you get the emotional side of people when they do have funds. It is their passion, motorsport. They will go that extra mile, and I think that's what they're doing. They've been very clever about how they've went about copying the Mercedes car, buying as much of the Mercedes-Benz car if they can as well. And it's only natural where they are. I would say I'm concerned where they're going to be going now, because it seems like McLaren and Renault are starting to get the better of them. And where can that team start to develop now with a car that was probably already pretty developed on the side of, if it was that down the direction of the Mercedes-Benz of last year? There's a point where it stops and the other teams start to move forward, and that's kind of where they found themselves yesterday, I believe, in a track that probably should have suited them more than most places that we race at this year.
Paul, of course, we were at Spa on the weekend, one of the great circuits. In closing here, I wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of tracks that we've unexpectedly got coming up on this year's calendar. Mugello in a couple of races' time and Istanbul Park. Now, if memory serves, you would have done the in-season test back in 2012 when Mugello was used. What are you expecting this iteration of cars to be like around that layout? We know the high-speed nature of the place. And do you suspect this might be the biggest test physically that the drivers will get all year when you factor in the weather in that part of the world in September?
It's just starting to cool down in Europe, fortunately, I think, for the drivers. But that is going to be, if fans could get there, that is going to be pretty epic to watch cars go around that track. It is, it's muscle power. And it's just fast flowing. When we were back there in the V8 days with the blown floors, we always were trying to get the lowest gear to get the highest RPM in corners. And I remember we didn't drop below third gear then. For the similar kind of engines, I think they're, dropping below fourth gear in qualifying is going to be something maybe where teams are when they're low on fuel. So the loads are going to be extreme, but it's just going to be beautiful, to go to a track that kind of goes through Tuscany, the valleys. It's up, down, cambered on, cambered off, high-speed chicanes, long 180-degree corners. It's a pretty special place. Of course, one of Ferrari's tracks, I don't think they're going to be the ones at the front of the field. But at the same point, I hope more than anything it brings Red Bull into the equation of Mercedes, because if we get a good straight fight with them, and I believe, with the tyres and the punishment they're going to get, that could be something we could look forward to.
Very much looking forward to Mugello. And just briefly touching on Istanbul Park, you raced there, I believe, once back in 2011, which was the most recent Turkish GP. Do you think that circuit still offers the same challenge that it did back then, or have the cars moved along so much aerodynamically that the corners like the famed quadruple apex turn 8 and what have you are going to be the dreaded easy flat with the as the drivers might say after qualifying?
It's going to throw up a great challenge. It's a great track to go back there. I think it definitely should be on the F1 calendar anyway. Don't think it ever really deserved to be off it. It is going to be easy flat, but what that maybe does is create opportunity further down a couple of corners later, because if you can follow each other flat through turn 8, slipstream down the hill into the left-hander, and then from there there's obviously going to be the DRS zone. It will create overtaking if they're close by. But that ultimate challenge of seeing cars going light, half spinning, on the edge, probably not. They're probably going to be absolutely planted, but it throws up something else, and another aspect of it. But when that track was designed, it was obviously designed for cars that, 12 years ago didn't have the downforce, had groove tyres, and the challenge was very different. Things move on, but at the same time, we saw some good racing where we didn't expect to see some good racing, and I'm sure the drivers will love it.
Definitely some terrific tracks coming up later in the season. Paul, we'll leave it there. It's been great to catch up with you to get your thoughts on how this very strange season, from a logistical point of view at least, is panning out. Really appreciate the insight, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Not a problem. Hopefully we'll be back down in Australia soon, heading off the season, and forget about this wild year that we've had.
That's all for this episode of In the Fast Lane. Thanks for joining us, and a big thanks to this week's guest, Paul Di Resta. We'll be back next week to review all of the action from Sunday's Italian Grand Prix at Monza, and we'll look ahead to the upcoming MotoGP triple header at Misano and Barcelona with a very special guest. You won't want to miss this one. Until then, for Michael Laminato, I'm Matt Clayton. Join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.